The Safety Task Force podcast is arming you with the necessary tools to combat safety in our fast-paced, dynamic world. Our interviews bring you the latest and greatest safety solutions from industry experts. If you're new to the industry or looking for ways to expand your knowledge and stay up to date with global safety trends, this podcast is for you. We are back with another episode of the Safety Task Force podcast. This week, I have Arlin Keck from Steel King. Welcome, Arlin.
Hello. How you doing?
I am well, thanks. Arlin, tell us a little bit about yourself and your role at Steel King.
Okay, I've been in the material handling industry for 40 plus years. I've been with Steel King Industries for 15 years as their corporate R&D engineer. My main focus is basically on ASRS racking structures, rack-supported buildings, work platforms, and basically customary racking. Okay, so I get the job that don't have the standard part numbers.
All right. Today, I was hoping that you could go over some rack safety design considerations. So maybe we'll start there. When we're designing a racking system, what are some safety factors that should be considered?
Well, obviously, number one is the safety of the workers. But that also leads into basically, hate to say it, but it's part of the world we live in today, the environment, is the liabilities for both our companies who make this product and for the end users. So that's another factor. One of the biggest things for safety when it comes to storage rack is product dislodgement. Okay, and this can happen in several ways. Product is not loaded on there correctly, bad pallets, beams become disengaged, a product is pushed off the back, and even shedding during a seismic event or something like that. So that's probably the number one thing. Number two, as you know from seeing various videos, and that is the other safety concern is if somebody damages the rack while in use. And we've all seen those videos where rack has fallen down, and unfortunately, some people have gotten hurt. Luckily, those that stay in the forklift usually survive it, but none of us want to see that. And I guess the third thing that comes into play is anytime there's a problem, even if nobody's hurt, something's dislodged, you slow down production. I mean, because you have to stop and clean it up. And
Sure.
The other thing they may do is break in-rack sprinkler lines and stuff like that. And all that hurts production in the bottom line. So that's why I think product containment safety is all important. It goes right to the bottom line.
Okay. Well, Arlin, how often or how frequently should rack be inspected? Do you recommend that you have a professional perform an inspection, or is that just a supervisor that can perform that?
Well, there are professional inspector groups out there, and I'm sure they do a great job. I think if you have an experienced warehouse manager, that person would be qualified to do it. Now, I'm talking a person's experience has been down the road a few times, has seen the damage that can be done to racking. He kind of knows what to look for. Actually, your rack vendors and stuff are also a great resource. Not that they really want to do the individual inspection, but they certainly are a source for telling you what to look for and to go about it, and possibly even to provide generic forms for inspection, at least to get you started. So, and to what to look for. So if you have a particular rack vendor that a warehouse or company likes, I would certainly call them and say, we want to do your inspection, and let me talk to some of your key people and see what we should be looking for.
So we'll kind of switch gears here. What factors can affect system capacity?
Well, there's a lot of factors, and before we even get into damage, there's factors that come into the initial design. As an engineer, I run into those all the time. So you start at your baseline, and the first thing is, what is the product? What is the load on the product? What is your vertical beam spacings? And what kind of operation are you trying to do? What kind of rack or what kind of operation is it? In other words, if you have a standard rack that just has palletized product on it, that's one set of loads. If you have like a pick module, which has floor loadings on it, conveyors and human traffic, that's a different kind of loading. So you start out with the basics. What does the configuration of the rack look like? What is your profile of your beams? What's your product on there? Then you kind of switch over to your next gear would be what's the seismicity of the area where the warehouse is or the rack is being installed. Is it going into a high seismic area like Southern California, a lower seismic area like Florida or Texas or Wisconsin? Those are different things. One of my other things I like to do is consider the environment it is going into. Now, most storage racks goes into a well-lit warehouse environment, okay, where you have what I will call professional forklift drivers, well-lit. But if you have a freezer application or something like that, which is a rougher environment, the aisles are narrow because you don't want to cool off this big building. The drivers go in there, if you ever seen them, they're all bundled up for the deep freeze. And those racks are probably some of the most damaged racks you'll ever see out there because of the tight aisles and just the environment. The other thing is the environment that racking is going into. Now, like I said, you can have a well-lit warehouse. That's one environment. But a lot of racking will go into an industrial fabricating plant kind of a warehouse for like die storage and that kind of stuff. In there, the floors are literally rough. The forklift drivers are probably some machine operator who, when he's not operating the machine, jumps to the forklift and vice versa. The other thing is consider what you are storing. If you're storing a case of pork and beans, which is worth $250, palletized load, or whether you're storing a $100,000 die that if it falls off the rack and breaks or gets damaged, your production is down. You're, like I said, you're talking $100,000 die. You also have to look at what your risk is and what's involved. And that's probably one of my little pet peeves there, because a lot of times people will just quote based on the capacity of what's being stored without involving a risk. And like I said, that's also where a lot of your protection comes in too, is the risk factor. Like I said, if you have very expensive equipment or dies on something, if a guy hits it, you really don't want the rack falling, even though it may not be the rack manufacturer's fault. You want to give the guy some safety that his product doesn't fall off the shelf. So there's, to me, that's a big factor, is the risk on the product involved and the replacement cost and downtime.
Well, are there common areas within the warehouse that you would consider high risk areas? And if so, what design considerations should be taken so that we can better protect those areas?
And as the way of protection, always your end of your aisles where somebody's turning in or changing direction. Many rack systems have what they will call tunnel bays within them where traffic can. So if you have a real long row of rack, you don't want to have to go all the way around the rack and maybe 200 feet long when necessary, it might be you have a tunnel bay in there. And obviously you need to protect those sides. These areas normally should have some sort of either freestanding post protector or kind of things at their end there, or some sort of a rubber rail along the side. So if somebody bumps it or the load hits it or something like that. Also, the front of all the racks, that's where most of the damage is caused. So there's post protectors there, reinforcing the columns, that kind of stuff. Going back to tunnel bays, that's another area where overhead is very important and product falling off overhead when somebody's driving through or walking through. So that's a great place for overhead netting or something like that to make sure product does not fall down. The other important area, especially having product knocked off the back of racks or something like that, is when you have a pedestrian aisle, let's say walking right alongside a product being stored, where it's very easy for an operator on one side to push it off. I mean, all you have to do is walk into your home centers, and you can see people loading the racking outside, and somebody could be one inside, and you can imagine a pallet load of bricks or shingles or something like that coming down on somebody.
Right.
So, and those folks do a very good job of blocking out all the aisles so it doesn't happen. But you can kind of visualize that even in an earthquake situation. So if you have, especially an aisle where you have a lot of human traffic on it, it's really kind of important to make sure the product doesn't fall off the back of that stuff and into that aisle. And I would say those are the key areas. But like I said, workstations, anything like that. Any place where a machine could hit something or where there are people around it.
Okay.
I was going to also add where sometimes there's a lot of electrical panels and stuff like that associated with racking, depending on if you're doing a pick module or something like that. So if you have that kind of stuff, obviously you want to protect the electrical panels and anybody who may be working on the electrical panels and that kind of stuff.
All right. So when are pallet load stops necessary?
Well, I've kind of mentioned a few, but like I said, probably your number one is a pedestrian aisle at the back. The other key thing is to keep in mind pallet shedding, especially during an earthquake event. Again, this would probably mostly apply to an aisle where there's a good chance of pedestrian traffic or workers below it or something like that. If you're in a high seismic area, you certainly don't want anything falling off in that direction. The other thing I would have to say is for pallet stops, and people don't think about it, but a lot of palletized product has a lot of in-rack fire protection to it, and the flue spaces are very important. You got to keep them open. So if you have a very flammable product or something like that, you would like to have pallet stops in there so you don't interfere with the fire protection or cover up the flue space, because those sprinklers rely on heat coming up to them to trigger them and stuff like that. So
okay.
The airflow is very important, or the heat flow is very important. You want to make sure you don't get product interfering with that flow.
Okay. And so when we talk about like the pallet load stops, I think that, correct me if I'm wrong, that's what you guys refer to them as at Steel King. But is that similar to like the netting or the wire mesh rack safety panels? Are those doing the same thing?
They kind of do the same thing, but not. If you have a very well palletized load with a good wrapping, pallet stop beams basically just stop the whole unit, but they can't stop individual product. So if you have what they call broken pallets and stuff like that, where somebody's picking from them, or individuals, then you want to look at your netting and that kind of your wire netting, your soft netting. You want to look at that versus a pallet stop. The pallet stop beams in and of themselves are really for a well palletized load. It's not going to be broken. And
okay.
You know it's going to be well palletized. Yeah.
All right.
And but netting would be better for obviously overhead pallet. I mean, pallet stops are for vertical movement. I mean, netting is what you use for tunnel bays and that stuff when you're worried about individual products falling off. And I've even seen this stuff with ASRS systems, which are supposed to be fairly mechanized, and you're not supposed to have that human factor in there. And still, these folks will put it there all the time just because they don't want. I mean, now you're talking product falling 15, 16, 70 feet, so that's the last thing you need is product falling off the back at those heights. So,
sure.
Yeah, that's where netting would come in. And security. Netting, obviously, pallet stops aren't good for security, whereas netting can be used for security. You're storing liquor, tobacco, something like that. Netting would be for those kind of things.
All right.
And we do run into areas in racking where, I mean, it's not just safety, but security. I mean, safety of securing products too is a big part of it, because there's always parts of warehouse that may have flammable products or very valuable products that are likely to disappear if not guarded.
Makes sense. Arlin, is there anything else that you would like to add or anything that we missed?
No, I think a lot of people look at the dollar signs and they wonder if it's worth it. And really, protection, be it built into the product or an accessory to the racking, it's such a minor part. And if you're looking at a 20 and 30-year life on the rack, it's kind of like an ounce of prevention is really worth a pound of cure. And
Right.
This the lost time could probably pay for some of the stuff. You know what I mean? So it's well worth considering. Okay, and I know everybody has budgets and stuff like that, but like I said, for a small amount of money for the protection, I think it's wise to really consider it and just say, okay, maybe I just need to upgrade a little bit for the long run.
Great. Well, Arlin, thanks for being on the show today. And we really appreciate you teaching us about the rack safety design considerations.
You're welcome.
That's all for this week's episode of the Safety Task Force podcast. Thanks for listening, and be sure to follow us on Facebook and Instagram at BeastAgentWN.